pivot now to talking about increased rating for ortho issues. We wanted to talk about this because we've got representation here from someone who practices before the agency and someone who practices before the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. And we do a lot of work, both before the regional offices and the court, on our orthopedic claims and appeals, and specifically in the increased rating context. There are tons of regulations and tons of cases. We're going to go through like the tip of the iceberg today. More than that, we're going to try to get this to be as comprehensive as possible, but there's no way we can do all of it. But CCK does have a very long history of being on the cutting edge of these kinds of issues, rating conditions that affect the orthopedic system. Those are complicated cases, and we're hoping that we can demystify some of what that process is. So it's true that VA disability claims and appeals should be fileable and appealable by individuals working on their own. But what we're going to be talking about next, getting increased ratings for orthopedic conditions, the reality is that these are pretty tricky claims. Practically speaking, the complexity and the scale of trying to get a proper rating for an orthopedic condition is large and pretty daunting. There are a lot of regulations that guide adjudicators in what to consider and what to look for in rating an orthopedic condition. We'll talk about this, but while VA's regulations are written very much in terms of range of motion, which is usually only detectable with testing and examination, there are a ton of other regulations alongside those rules that talk about the import of limiting pain and painful motion and the differences between active and passive motion and things like that. So we're going to talk today about some of the applicable laws and regulations, some policies, and some court cases, including a bunch of CCK homegrown precedent-setting cases that have helped interpret the complex issues that can come up in increased rating for orthopedic condition cases. This is why VA-accredited lawyers do exist. This is why we are sharing this information, because this stuff is not easy. If you are battling one of these types of cases on your own, consider calling an advocate to help. Hopefully we give enough help today that people find this process more navigable, but don't beat yourself up if you're finding this tricky. This stuff took a while for us to learn. So Nick, why don't you give us some context, just kind of generally, what's an increased rating for ortho case like? What are the things that you think about?
Yeah, so as the name suggests, increased rating for ortho, I might refer to it as IR ortho. That's what I'm talking about. Just anything dealing with the bones, muscles, nerves, joints generally. So whether it's your ankle, elbow, knees, your back is obviously a big one. Scars as well. I feel like maybe at the court level, I deal less with scars, but backs, knees, all of that falls under ortho. And really, it's sort of the second piece of the puzzle when you're dealing with your service-connected disabilities. The first is getting them service-connected, and that can be a challenge in and of itself. But once you get that, you get to then make sure you have the proper rating. And that can either be disagreeing with the initial rating they give you, or sometime in the future filing for an increased rating claim, if it gets worse over time, which, obviously is just common that over a 5, 10, 20-year period since you first got it rated, it, could deteriorate. So that's what we're generally talking about with IR ortho claims. And yeah, VA just on this topic alone has dozens of regulations, and there are court cases going back, almost 40 years at this point. So we're all still trying to figure it out. It's more complex than it might seem on the surface.
For sure. And common, because as Nick mentioned, orthopedic conditions are typically progressively worsening over time. So a lot of individuals that we work with who have a diagnosis of a back condition, maybe when they're a 30-year-old just out of service veteran, that person is probably in for decades of potential increased rating claims based on the natural progression and deterioration of the joint or the affected area. So some of the regulations that come to mind, and there are many, we've got 4.40 that talks about functional loss. It defines disabilities of the musculoskeletal system as primarily the inability to perform the normal working movements of the body. And I would say this regulation is a clue to us that VA cares about compensating the degree to which joints have deteriorated and are not working and moving properly. Mm-hmm. There's also 4.45 that talks more about the joints. It gives a laundry list of things that VA has to consider when rating joint conditions, like whether movement in the joint is more, less than what you want, weakened, painful, excess fatigability in the joint. Does it cause incoordination of movement? Is there pain on movement? There's 4.56 and 4.73, which talk about evaluation of muscle disabilities and ratings for muscle conditions, respectively. There's 4.59 that we'll talk about later that talks about painful motion, specifically the intention to recognize actually painful, unstable, or malaligned joints as at least minimally compensable. It sounds repetitive, but all of this kind of gets to the point that VA's rating schedule is meant to compensate impairment in earning capacity, and conditions of the musculoskeletal system or of the joints are typically, like the hallmark cases of those things are functional impact that VA wants to compensate depending on the severity of those conditions.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the complexity in these cases arrives from sort of, it can be VA's general interpretation or goal is to, compensate for functional impairment. VA's regulations show that when it comes to these orthopedic conditions, they view that primarily through the lens of restricted motion. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you do have restricted motion, that is going to cause impairments. But what so many of these regulations, the ones you were just talking about, and so many of the court cases that we'll get into are focused on is figuring out what functional loss or the functional equivalent to loss of motion is. So, any veteran who's gone to a C&P exam for their back or their knee, knows that they're going to be run through the range of motion testing requirements. But the reality is you'll have a lot of veterans who, you may have arthritis in your knee, but you may also just have full range of motion. Mm-hmm. But then while it's moving, it may be very painful. It may just feel weak. It may, after a long day of walking around, just feel way more sore and tired than, it otherwise would have. So VA has acknowledged that, there are ways in which you can lose function as if it were, or at the same level as if it were actually restricted, the range of motion, but figuring out how to apply that in practice and get somebody the rating that accurately, captures their disability is, just where the tricky part is. So to dive a little bit deeper into a couple of the regulations there, mm-hmm. Section 4.40 is kind of the seminal baseline functional loss regulation. And had some highlights on here. I just want to pull out the exact language. Mm-hmm. So to pull the language from the regulation itself, VA defines, disability of a musculoskeletal system as the inability to perform the normal working movements of the body with normal excursion, strength, speed, coordination, and endurance. So again, those are all factors that even if you are able to move your knee through the full range of motion, can you do it with the regular strength, the regular excursion? Can you keep it up for as long as somebody without a disability might be able to? And if you can't, that's what you should be compensated for, notwithstanding the mechanical range of motion. Mm-hmm. Section 4.45, it's titled The Joints, and it kind of goes through the factors that VA is supposed to consider, again, beyond just range of motion. So they do have less movement than normal in subsection A. subsection B, more movement than normal. As you alluded to, that can be more in cases where, a healed injury causes malunion or non-union of the knee or the tibia, kind of where it causes instability. Like I said before, weakened movement, excess fatigability, incoordination, so the impaired ability to execute skilled movements. And then last but not least, pain on movement. So pain on movement is another big thing that the regulations deal with, that that the court that I work in front of has been dealing with going back to the 90s. And what do you know? VA has a regulation titled Painful Motion, section 4.59. And again, I just want to pull the actual language from the quote. Section 4.59, which is titled Painful Motion, talks about what VA or how VA should look at and rate pain. Again, notwithstanding the actual range of motion present. They say in their regulation that a joint that becomes painful on movement must be treated as seriously disabled. And here in this regulation, they note that when you have pain on movement, you should be entitled to at least the minimum compensable rating for that joint. So even if you don't meet the range of motion requirements for a 10% for your knee, if it hurts while you're moving your knee, you should still have a 10% rating for it. So it's something to keep in mind, where if you get service connected granted for your knee, great, and they award a 0%, just ask yourself, like, well, does my knee hurt? Presumably it does to some degree, because that's why you had some problems with it. If it hurts, you should file an appeal there and try to get at least that 10% rating. Again, that's just from section 4.59 there. So those are just a couple of the more important ones that come up in in our work.
Great. And I think I would bet that there are people listening who are wondering why these regulations talk about things like painful motion, incoordination, inability to move with normal speed and excursion. That experience, or those factors, I should say, are not always the experience that veterans have when they go into an exam for an ortho condition when they're pursuing an increased rating. So if you have been to an exam and you're pursuing an increased rating for a painful joint, you do experience a lot of the things that Nick and I are talking about, more or less movement because of malunion of joints or an inability to get around with normal speed. It can be hard to understand why VA's focus in the exam is so very much on range of motion. So we recognize that these regulations and the cases that we're about to talk about are not always the focus in that exam room. In the exam room, it's all about the measurements of how much flexion, extension, abduction, et cetera, the joint is able to achieve, because that comports with VA's rating schedule. All of these regulations and cases, and I'd be curious for Nick's take on this, the way that I see them is that these contextualize and can really help people pursuing an increased rating because, as Nick mentioned before, when you show up to an exam and you're taking range of motion measurements that are supposed to represent how severe your disability has been for years sometimes, so many different factors can be present on the day of the examination. You might be rested or you might not be rested. You may have taken Advil that day or not. You may have had a really strenuous day the day before, or maybe you rested the day before. So the way that you're showing up to the exam can be different, and that can really influence range of motion measurements. So I say that because, number one, I think it's important to set expectations. People that are pursuing increased ratings for ortho conditions and joints, there's going to be a ton of emphasis on range of motion, and that's right. But there are also these rules that exist alongside range of motion measurements that are meant to better flesh out the degree to which the condition is functionally disabling.